Going into the shul just now, because the last time I went in was 11 years ago when they brought my father's coffin into the shul. Already the top was closed off, but it was such a pleasure now to go in and see it, because it brought back, that didn't bring back happy memories, but when I was a child then. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the history of South Manchester and how it came about, because in the 1860s and 1870s, the Jewish community in Manchester was centred in the north, in North Manchester, and the more affluent moving out towards Higher Broughton. At the same time, a fashionable residential suburb was being developed in the All Saints area, Oxford Road in Manchester, intended to mirror areas like Belgravia and Mayfair. They thought they were coming up in the world. A few Jewish businessmen who no longer wished to live in Cheetham Hill or the vicinity and who were not affluent enough to move further north or south settled in the new suburb and continued to worship in the great synagogue in Cheetham Hill Road, half an hour away. In 1872, David Cowan, a jeweller, together with a few neighbours, declared that they had silently suffered years of having to walk over half an hour to shul every week, and that they should have a place to worship which was nearer. A meeting was called, and by Rosh Hashanah on the 3rd of October, services were held in Chorlton Town Hall in All Saints, conducted by Reverend H. Marks. Despite opposition by the great synagogue towards what they had viewed as a breakaway community, that they'd stolen the minister, the search began to look for permanent premises by then. In June 1873, 9 months after the congregation was first established, a 3-storey building in Sydney Street, a former orphan home and billiard hall, was purchased for £930 and converted for the sum of £870 into a synagogue, with seats for 100 men and ladies' gallery for 60 women. After only 2 months, in September 1873, it was ready to be consecrated by the chief Rabbi Nathan Adler in time for Rosh Hashanah. And then, by 1907, the congregation started to become financially secure, and they searched for a suitable premises. And 2 sites were shortlisted. One was the Norman Road in Rusholme, opposite Platt Fields, and the other one was Wilbraham Road, where we are now. Despite being the more favoured location, as it was convenient for members of the community who lived in the highly selected areas of the Victoria Park, Norman Road had to be abandoned as it was too small. So they started thinking about building here, and they had a very young architect called Joseph Sunlight, who was only 23 years old. You can see his tombstone in Southern Cemetery to this day. Anyway, he constructed techniques particularly for the dome, which attracted attention from as far afield as the United States. Now, this is a very, very attractive building. It always was. It was modelled upon a Byzantine temple, and with its flat main dome and dome-surmounted tower, presents a typically Eastern appearance, and there were no pillars on the interior. So it was a very, very unusual shape, and you don't see many synagogues with that. So it was a Byzantine type of style. The new synagogue, built to accommodate 300 men and 100 women in the gallery, opened with just a few women and was consecrated by Rabbi Hertz on the 20th of October 1913. So that's when it started here, 1913. Within a few years, the community finances were giving cause for concern. Maintaining the minyan during the week and on Shabbat continued to be a problem. Then, in 1921, the economic crisis affected the congregation heavily, and there were frequent discussions concerning reducing the salaries of the officials in the synagogue. The synagogue flourished for many years in its new location, due in no small part to the arrival of successive waves of refugees from Europe in the 1930s. Such was the growth in membership that an extension had to be built in the Ladies' Gallery, and later additional parallel services to be held in the new synagogue hall during the High Holy Days, and membership peaked from 800 during the 1970s. So those are the early days of this lovely, lovely building. Right, now I'll leave it there, and I will talk about my experiences now. I just wanted to give you the background. Reverend Weewo was the minister prior to my father here. And at that time, he had fled to England from Germany. My parents had fled in 1939. They managed to get out thanks to Rabbi Dr. Schoenfeld, who arranged visas for rabbis and teachers to arrive on the shores here. And they arrived with 10 shillings each in their pocket. That was all they were allowed to have. Rabbi Schoenfeld said to my father, visit the chief Rabbi Hertz and to gain employment, and there happened to be an opening at Palmer's Green Synagogue in London, because Rabbi Chait, who was the rabbi, was a chaplain to the forces, and because of that he was away, and they said to my father, take the job, but once he comes back, you're out. So this must have been up to 1947 when Rabbi Chait came back. But I'll talk about it in a minute. So on the first Shabbat, the chief rabbi thrust a sermon at my father. He had no idea what he was saying. Absolutely not. He just read it parrot fashion. But he always said because he'd learned Greek and Latin, he was able to learn English quite well. And he loved vocabulary. And later on, he was speaking it beautifully. But that was very, very hard at the beginning. Having been a teacher, he had no intention to become a rabbi. And he didn't know how to proceed with weddings and funerals and so on. And it was quite a headache until something happened that was very, very good. He had the good fortune that the retired Sol Lipson, who happens to be the grandfather of Robert, Lord Robert Winston, you know, the Guyman fellow, his grandfather took my father under his wing, and Dad was eternally grateful because he taught him everything that he needed to know about the Anglo-Jewish customs. So it was a good learning ground while he was in Farmers Green. When Rabbi Chait returned after the war, Dad had to find another position. And in Leicester, they offered him a position, which he accepted. But at the same time, suddenly, he got an offer here at South Manchester. What a dilemma. My mother said to him, listen, there'll be better schooling for the kids, because he had 3 little girls. He said, try and get to Manchester, it's better for you than Leicester. So my mother said, you'd better go personally to Leicester and explain that Manchester would have more educational possibilities for the children. So he went personally, and the president was more than understanding and released him. So he then came to Manchester, and he had an interview with the president of the shul. He came up with his mum. And the president said, he took one look at my mum, who was a very attractive lady, and he said, we'll have him. Anyway, the people in... My mum didn't want to leave London, you can imagine. People said, why would you want to go to the grimy north, where it always rains? Someone said to her, you need 3 things. You need an umbrella, a raincoat, and a return ticket. Anyway, at the age of 36, my father looked upon this opportunity as a stepping stone to better things. In the end, they loved it here so much they stayed happily in this shul for 40 years. And then he retired and still lived in Didsbury all his life. But how did this German refugee get the job? It was only because of my attractive mum. Anyway, Many of the congregation were German refugees, like him, but the trouble was the board of management, terribly English and Victorian in their outlook. And they thought, what are we having this German fellow here for, you know? And they were not happy, and they gave him a really rough time. But Father was never to be a puppet on a string, but he was patient, and he kept his mouth shut. When the two difficult members finally died, it was sad, but he thought, now I can get on with what I want to do. Michael Landau was the new president and a big admirer of my dad. And he said, Felix, you're the director, get on with it. Cousin Morris was there. He was a lovely man, and he and my dad got on very, very well together. And Mr. Wilner was the secretary. One of the first influences Dad made was to introduce the Chevra Kadisha. My father didn't want undertakers to do this sacred job, and many of the congregants came forward to perform this holy task. A minyan in the morning was almost non-existent, so he organised a rota. On one day, he had the doctors coming. On another day, he had the dentists coming. On another day, he had the textile merchants. And that way, they had a rota. And it gave him great pride that the minyan carried on very, very well. Most congregants were not religious. They were traditional and had warm hearts and keen to follow his example. Mr. Desser was one of the people here, and he paid for the sukkah to be built, the Simon Desser sukkah, so that was also paid for. The second night Seder in the shul was introduced because many people didn't bother with a second night, so my dad made a second night here, and that really went down very, very well. Very few teachers for the Hebrew classes lived in Didsbury, in South Manchester, so they had to recruit them from North Manchester. And they came down very, very happily. One of them was, do you know Jeffrey Cohen, Rabbi Jeffrey Cohen, who was at Stanmore? He married Gloria. Anyway, Gloria was one of the teachers here as well, and my mum taught here, I taught here as well, but the others all came from North Manchester for the Sunday morning classes, and also they had one midweek. The time came when the shul hall was getting far too small. It was an old hall. So money was needed. In fact, a vast sum was needed. There was a gentleman in the shul called Colonel Stern. He lived in on the outskirts of Manchester and rarely entered the shul. He was unmarried, and it was known that his deceased uncles, the Steele brothers, were very wealthy and not community-minded. It was suggested that my dad went over to this Colonel Stern and had a chat with him and see if he could help with this project. So he suggested that his late uncle's names could be perpetuated if he gave the money for the steel hall. The visit went very well, and my father was offered £500. He got up and thanked him and explained that that really wasn't sufficient for a hall. So Colonel Stern said, "What were you thinking of?" My father told me, I don't know what that's, I couldn't find out, but it was a vast, vast sum. He mentioned a figure, and at once Colonel Stern took out his checkbook and wrote the suggested amount for the Steel Memorial Hall in memory of this fellow's uncles. Imagine the joy on my father's face when that happened. The two men celebrated with the whiskey. And he then went and called the rest of his board home, and they all came, and there was untold joy because this could now be built. And that was a lovely, lovely hall. We had the second services there on the Chagim as well, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And it's not down now, isn't it? I think so.
It's not down.
Yeah, but it was absolutely amazing. And our youth club used to, I've got a lovely photo of all the youth club in that area. Right. You may be too young to remember the Munich air crash? Manchester United football team were in a plane. Do any of you remember that? Maybe not. It was 1957, and at least, no, I wouldn't expect you to remember it, but you might have heard about it if you're Manchester United key. 23 people were killed in that crash.
Well,
my dad...
No.
Sorry?
The entire team?
Almost. And not only that, but one of the members from this shul was a sports reporter called Henry Rose. He was killed as well. So
what happened to the plane?
A lot of them were saved, but my dad was the chaplain at the Manchester Ringway Airport, and he went out there when they had that. He also went out as chaplain when there was a fire on board another plane, and he was there with all the people. Anyway, the plane crashed, and 23 were killed, and Henry Rose's sisters gave the money for the Henry Rose Sports, what was it called? The Henry Rose Sports Centre. Outside the Steel Hall, they had a sport area, and Henry Rose was perpetuated by that. Oh, I must tell you something else that happened. After the first game that United played, when they slowly got the team together, they invited my father to come to a reception at the town hall. So I said to my mum, "You're not going to that, I'm going to that, because I want to show off to the girls at school that I've met all the team." So I went with him, and I met all the team. I got all their autographs, including Matt Busby's, and then the Milan team gave me their address, and then the linesmen, who were Danish, gave me not only their signature, they also gave me their addresses, but it's all right, I didn't follow it up. But I've got it in my autograph book, the whole team there. Right. Now, Felix was one of the first rabbis to instigate bat mitzvah. But in those days, they only had it on a Sunday, and they had 8 or 10 girls. I missed out. He did it after I was past that age. But my sister was the first one. And my mother prepared the bat mitzvah classes. There was an uproar at one of those classes, one of those bat mitzvah ceremonies, because my father spoke to the girls about marrying out. And several of the parents objected. They thought it was wrong for him to raise it at the bat mitzvah. But he stood his ground, and he said that was the right time to raise it, because those girls had to be aware of the problems later on. So that was a little controversy. In fact, I've still got the Jewish Telegraph. It was the headlines. In the 60s, a David Salem, member of the Sephardi Synagogue, decided to make a youth minyan, not on the shul premises. My father was furious. He strongly believed, as he had done in Germany in his rabbinical family, that the sons should be next to their father in the shul. As a result, many of our lovely committed teenagers were not to be seen again here. Now, years later, as my sister Naomi tells me, we were sitting shiva for our father when David Salem arrived. And Naomi, my sister, said, "I apologize for my father's behavior over the years." And David said, "There are 2 things you should know, Naomi. You cannot apologize for another person. And secondly, now that I'm much older, perhaps he was right." So that was rather nice. Locally, there were 4 rabbis, because there was Queen's Road with Rabbi Gugin. There was the Shari Tzedek Synagogue, a very Persian one down there in Didsbury, with Rabbi Ades. And then there was Rabbi Selwyn Goldberg at Jackson's Road Synagogue. That was the Reform Synagogue. Anyway, as well as obviously this shul here, because these 4 men respected each other, I think a number of people would be really surprised today that they all got on. They weren't nasty to each other at all, and they respected one another. A number of people left the Reformed synagogue to join South Manchester and felt most comfortable here as well. In North Manchester, at first, they didn't take South Manchester seriously enough. But I'm glad to say that changed when the respect that they felt for what was being done here was acknowledged. As was the custom in those days, the management wore top hats. Simchat Torah and Purim were very sedate because my father put his thumb on everything. Now I've seen, the throwing of sweets at a bar mitzvah. I've never seen that before, and I can't do it myself. I'm not used to it. I don't know if you are.
You've been to North Manchester on Purim?
I cannot go to a shul on Purim anymore because the balagan, it just gets me. But you see, that's because of the way I was brought up.
In which case I'd recommend Babette. That's a very sedate one.
Is it today?
Yeah.
Right. Well, I don't know if he'd go down well today, but in those days, if anyone was disturbing during the service, there was a knock on the bima, on the desk, and everybody shut up. They just froze. But I'll tell you something, a lot of the kids particularly were scared of him. But underneath he was as soft as butter, he really was. Anyway, I'll tell you, my boyfriends used to meet me outside because they were scared to come in. And when I'd finished school, I decided I had to get away, not stay here, because I didn't have any views of my own. He was a loving father, he was wonderful, we had a lovely youth, don't get me wrong, but I felt I needed to have views of my own. And when I got my first essay at uni, I was scared stiff. I didn't have any views of my own. It really frightened me. So the best thing I did was to leave home and find out who I was. And it helped. So, that was one of the problems of being a rabbi's daughter, I think. Anyway, he was available 24 hours a day. Can you imagine? If the phone would go in the middle of the night, we'd hear him going out the door. We didn't have a car in those days. The person who phoned him, because there was someone seriously ill, met him outside and took him. We hardly saw our parents on a Sunday because they had either a bar mitzvah, a wedding, or funeral, or all of them. So, he and my mother were a very, very good team, and they loved doing what they did. And it was a pleasure to see what they did. But as kids, we missed them, because they were so hands-on. What else can I tell you? He was chaplain to the Christie Hospital as well, which is the renowned cancer hospital in Withington. And on Christmas Day, we all went from the shul and served the meals. You couldn't do that with health and safety today. But we all served the meals to the patients on Christmas Day, and anyone that had cars took the nurses to their home or back to the hospital because there weren't buses and so on. And it was so much appreciated, you can imagine. So that's what we did then. He gave a sermon every Shabbat, and people hung on his every word. And today that I have moved back from London, and I'm now at the South Manchester Synagogue in Bowden, so many people give me quotes that they remember from him, which is lovely. It's nice. It really is lovely to hear the effect that he had on them over his 40 years here. Every Friday night, after we'd had dinner, young people, students and so on, came to our house, and he discussed Torah topics with them. And on Shabbat, we often had students for dinner. So it was lovely, we were really involved with it all. He was a very talented musician. He had to choose between being a rabbi and a musician, I think, at one point, but he was a very good pianist. He adored Mahler and Bruckner, which not everybody did. The music that came out, we had Radio 3 on the whole time. When I went to bed on a Sunday night, I had Radio Luxembourg on under my pillow because I wanted to hear the top 20. But he had Radio 3 on all the time. I played a lot of piano duets with him and had a really musical start with him. He used a lot of, his sermons were dotted with musical anecdotes as well, which was also nice. Friends of the Halley from the congregation, they gave him a concert every year, the Carlebach concerts at the Halle, for 25 years. And it was lovely. He was asked to choose the programme, and we had a concert once a year. I used to come up from London for them. They were fantastic. And then afterwards we had a reception to which the conductor came and the soloist came. Jackie Dupre and Daniel Berenbaum were there at one of them. I mean, it was just absolutely wonderful. So those concerts were at the Halle, but at the Bridgewater Hall afterwards. I think I'm nearly finished. Here we are. He was very active in the Blind Society, the Neighbourhood, and the Council of Christians and Jews as well. In 1954, he received an MA. He studied at Manchester University, and he used to type out with 2 fingers on his old typewriter, and I used to read out the notes to him that he'd made for his thesis. But he got an MA from Manchester University. I used to go to the Rylands Library in town, I think, which had a beautiful Jewish section as well, and did a lot of work there. And then he got his samicha from the yeshiva in Yerushalayim in 1974, so bless you. So instead of being a reverend, he then became a rabbi. That was in 74. He was chaplain to 5 Lord Mayors, because 5 fellows from this congregation here became mayors of Manchester. There was Leslie Lever, I can't remember all of them, but he was. There was a very funny thing that happened. He had to bench at these dinners that they had, you know. And they had a master of ceremonies in his gown and so on, and he had a piece of paper in front, and he said, "The rabbi will now belch." Instead of bench. He got it all wrong. So anyway, what else? Yes, so he was chaplain. He returned to Germany a couple of times. It must have been hard. He asked the chief rabbi's permission to do so. He went with my mother the first time, and they went. You hear all sorts of things, and we never said anything. And I had a few, he had a very difficult funeral once. A fellow, his wife had died, and he saved the plot next to the wife for the fellow for himself. Anyway, he then remarried. When he died, the wife he was with now said, "I'm not having him lying next to her." I don't know how he solved that, but that was the sort of problem he had to cope with. He also, one member of the congregation was found in a hotel room dead, and he had to go in and get rid of the mistress before the wife came along. You know, it's all these sorts of things that were going on. You have to be very, very discreet. Oh yes, there were lots of things like that.
What happened?
I don't know. I don't know. I'm sorry he's not here to tell you. And then there was another one where I was in Bournemouth, and I was with some people in a restaurant. And as I walked up the stairs to the restaurant, there was one of his congregants, but not with his wife. The fellow choked on his food, but I never even told my parents. But you know, this was happening all the time. But we enjoyed a very privileged upbringing. And I'm really happy that those memories are here, and I have very happy memories of growing up there. It must have been so hard for them with their 10 shillings in their pocket. We didn't have much, and in those days, rabbis did not get a decent salary. They got something shipped at a funeral or in the pocket, a little extra. But it was a very poor salary in those days. But we never felt we were missing out at all. And I look back with great joy at that time, and I'm so happy to see you in this building, because I got married in this shul, it brings back so many memories, and I'm glad it's being used for the youth today. So thank you for asking me here, and I hope I've answered I've fulfilled what you wanted me to do.
Yes, definitely. Do you have time for
Yes, if I can answer.
Anyone want to know more?
Yes, sir.
What happened in the war years here?
In the war years here?
Because there's some plaques for those who fought in the First and the Second World War.
There were, that's right. Well, we weren't here then. It was before then, but the plaques commemorated the people who they belonged to that were in the shul at that point, yes. I mean, the war was very difficult. My parents were lucky to get out. If they hadn't got out, I wouldn't be here. And they lost, my dad lost his father and mother in the camps, uncles, cousins, loads of them. Last week, Rabbi Lewis from our shul in Bowden took a group of people to Poland. And my grandson at 23 went with. And he sent me photos of plaques where our names of all the family were on. It meant a lot, but I don't know if any of you have a chance to go. I've been to Auschwitz, but only for a day. I didn't want to stay longer. But, you know, this is going on all the time, and they had survivors, and there aren't that many left anymore, but they had a survivor with them who was able to tell them about it.
Was it Leslie Clyman?
Sorry?
Was it Leslie Clyman?
I don't know, because I wasn't there. I'd only just come back from Israel, but they were there while that happened. But no, it was, you know, so if you get a chance to go to the camps, particularly with a survivor, because once they've died, it's the next generation that have to talk about it.